We're extraordinarily charitable. I say, when we used to have fights over official development assistance numbers with the Europeans, your dad used to bring this up, and I loved it, was the fact that, yes, our official development assistance numbers were always lower than the Europeans were as a percent of their GDP, but our private contributions eclipsed them, multiple times. And so it's one of those things that, no, Americans are actually rather generous. We help people around the world. We're going to continue to help people around the world. That's not going away. And I'll say this, too, from a presidential point of view. There's never been a president in history, maybe, some exception, but none that I know of, that didn't want to make gifts here and there. Every president wants to go abroad and make a gift. PEPFAR was President Bush's program, Compassionate Conservative. I thought it was fantastic. This is an amazing way to say, you know what, here's a health issue, but we care, right? You can be a conservative and care. Being a conservative doesn't mean you don't care, right?
All right, welcome back to Unsung Americans. Glad to have everyone back. Hit that like, subscribe, and share button. Please share with your skeptical friends and family especially. Unsung Americans is a podcast where we showcase frontline aid worker stories from the actual work on the ground in plain English and simple terms so that people can understand what the work really looked like. This week, I am excited and proud to have Loren Stoddard, a former Foreign Service officer from USAID, who has far too many stories to share in this conversation, but we're going to get into a few here and kind of go back and forth and share some of it with you. So, Loren, why don't you introduce yourself and maybe just kind of briefly speak to what type of work you did with USAID throughout your career?
Sure. So I was a private enterprise officer. I joined AID with an interest to do economic development work. I was always interested in kind of small businesses and import-export and helping companies, create jobs. It was kind of what always motivated me is when people have a job, life is better. And when people don't have a job, life is bad. And so the idea of creating jobs made a lot of sense to me. I'd been a food broker around the world and just seen small businesses need some support now and then to kind of do what they do. And so I actually read an ad that AID had put out about, private enterprise officers helping small companies grow and develop around the world. And I thought, this is fantastic. So I applied.
And that's how you end up. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say is it's funny because what I didn't understand was how aid works, of course. I ran into aid the first time in Bolivia, of all places. I was in La Paz, and I was doing import-export brokering for a supermarket, and they were looking for hearts of palm, little palm hearts at the time everybody was excited about. And someone told me they had them at the embassy, and I couldn't get it through my head that they had these at the embassy for some reason. And so, in La Paz. And so I went there with my little blue passport. I had no idea what an embassy did outside of, checking passports and things. And I sat down in a conference room and I met someone who told me about their Hearts of Palm program. And I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe that the U.S. government was involved in this thing. And I immediately thought, do they know how markets work? Do they know how to work with buyers and sellers? I think I should think about this. And that was kind of my introduction, literally in La Paz.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's also, I should say, and you can tell me if you're experienced with kind of people across the industry, whether it was directly working for the federal government for USAID or for a nonprofit that was doing the work or a private contractor. I would say I've generally found that that's an unusual story that someone came from was purely just working in the private sector as buying, selling food, food brokerage essentially, right?
Yeah. It was kind of an odd
would you say
thing.
it's kind of unusual?
It's totally unusual. And it was kind of funny that, I don't know, my friend told me to do this. It was but I went in there and ever since then, when I've joined AID, I've always looked for people like I was. Because what's great about food brokers and people in the business is typically they don't have the time to talk. They're busy doing whatever they're doing. And the whole aid world is outside of their frame of reference. They have no idea that there's a group of people out there trying to promote these kinds of things. And so connecting those two was actually one of my secret weapons in AID. Whenever I wanted to develop a good economic growth program, I'd go find old food brokers and I'd ask them what was going on and how the business was going and how the market was going. And because I could speak their language, I instantly had a better idea than many of my colleagues as to how to actually do market development and how to connect people and these kinds of things because I had that background. So it was very helpful, but it was cool because I think when the aid money gets into actual value chain, so, supporting and actually helping the small businesses, amazing things can happen.
Yeah. And that was my experience. And this was more not exactly the same thing, but this was more the area that I I would say I spent more of my time working in as well in a different capacity. But something you said is interesting is the difference between going into a country, especially as an American, to a foreign country, and when I'd be trying to put together good ideas for activities for a program and network around, figure out what was going on in the market, who was doing what, who was selling the things that mattered the most. If you wanted to meet with someone in government, if you wanted to meet with someone at a business association, at a nonprofit, just about anything other than a business, you could get an hour and a half, 2 hour meeting and have a long conversation. And there are plenty of good conversations to have there. That's fine. But if you were meeting with someone who was running a business or at a business, especially a small business, many of them very gracious and they'd spend time with you, but that was a 30-minute meeting, right?
For
Exactly
sure.
to your point.
It was
I
to
mean,
the
I remember
point.
doing this in Vietnam, and it was, what do you need? Access to export markets. What are your challenges? The administrative process for exporting goods, challenges, whatever else it was, right? But it was very practical, straightforward things, not necessarily straightforward, but it all made a lot of sense. So anyhow,
Which is, I think, was the secret to good AID economic development programs, is that you started to link to people. I was in Afghanistan years ago, and I asked a buddy, I said, hey, he was a food broker. And I said, so of all the products that Afghanistan has to export, what would you bet your own money on? And he said, pomegranates. I said, really? He said, I didn't thought about pomegranates in my life. And we talked about it, and we ended up boosting, pomegranate exports and dealing with Palm Wonderful and planting a bunch of pomegranate trees, and it ended up being a huge success. And it's actually, to this day, the Afghans are exporting tons of pomegranate juice, because it turns out it's a really good product from Afghanistan. And I found that out talking with an old food broker.
so you don't know this. This is going to be a good example of how authentic these conversations are, just to plug there. But I worked on that project, but I was on the team supporting it in DC. So I know that's true. And I remember our team in Afghanistan was going to Dubai for a big food expo. And then I think to India, I think was one of the
India.
other big trade shows that they went to. But what I actually did not realize, and which is actually really cool to hear, is that it turned into this big, I guess still is a big export market for.
Huge. And funny thing, by the way, on that story, you mentioned India. I knew Afghanistan had a winner when I went to fruit shops in India, and I'd say, "What's your best product?" And they pull out the pomegranate, anar, and I'd say, "Great, where's this from?" And they'd say, "It's anar kandari," and I'd say, "Where's it from?" And they'd say, "Pakistan." And of course, the name means Kandahari pomegranates. And I realized they were getting it from Pakistan, but it was such a high demand product. They were so excited about it. They were so proud to sell it in an Indian fruit shop. They didn't know about Afghan politics or where Kandahar was or anything like that.
Right.
But it was a winner product. And it turns out to be one of the best things Afghanistan has. Amazing. Not a lot of people heard about that, but I think different times it was a huge win. In fact, at one point there was a Time magazine article about mimosas saving Afghanistan. This is making a mimosa out of pomegranate juice. That was the idea. But anyway, drink up. We actually had Palm Wonderful come, and the guys from Palm Joy from England and others. But great pomegranate juice, best in the world. 1 kilo pomegranates, 2 pounds. Amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we can use that example. We could talk about some others, but why would the U.S. invest in something like that? Why would we do that? And again, it could be, we can talk about the pomegranate example, Afghanistan. We could talk about, other products, new markets that were created, jobs created, all those kinds of things. Is kind of, you have I'm sure a lot of good examples and stories there, but the main question, why was USAID doing that? Why were we investing in that?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. I think it's interesting when everything about why do Americans care about other countries, and there's a few reasons. One, we like their stuff. We just do. We buy a lot of things from other countries. We like their fruit. We like sometimes their minerals. We like what they make. People have been buying China from China for centuries. That's why it's called China. There's a lot of other products that come from different places. Potatoes all eventually come from Peru back in the day, or chocolate or coffee or other kinds of things. Turns out we like a lot of these products. And sometimes they find their way to American markets and sometimes they don't. And when they do find their way to American markets, life is generally better. So there is actually an attitude of buying. The United States is always interested in buying new products, the best the world has to offer. The other thing is that when we want to buy those products, if those value chains, as we call them, are successful, you can get more of them. If the value chains break, you get less of them. So it comes a very simple thing that if you want that value chain to work, if you want to get more of these products, you might have to invest in it a little bit so that it's a reliable value chain. Because, if you fall in love with something and then you can't get it again, well, that's frustrating. The other thing too is, of course, people grow those products. There's farmers out there. There's farmers, there's processors, there's shippers out there. And if those folks do well, then guess what? Those products are more available. They'd be cheaper. They might have more variety. There's a lot of things that are available in the world. And as we collaborate with those people selling those things, we end up being better off. So there's no question about that. The other side, of course, is what if we don't buy their product? What if it just goes around the area? Do we care inherently? Well, we might care for other reasons. Maybe that's a country that has, drugs coming our way, and we're worried about the drugs coming our way, and we're trying to give those farmers something to do besides producing drugs. Or maybe we're worried about those people not having a job and feeling desperate. This is one of the things that bothers me tremendously. Desperation is what leads many times to insurgency. I mean, just the reality. People feel like they have no
100%.
choice and they go to bad things. And so this is one of the issues that if you don't care about job creation, well, what about 9/11, right? I mean, and 9/11 wasn't necessarily a product of people who were out of work, but it comes out of this world of people that are desperate. They're desperate for money. They're desperate for influence. They're desperate for resources in some way. They're frustrated that they don't have more than they have. And so then they attack. And this happens just over and over again around the world. So again, when you're one of the richest countries or the richest country in the world and you're sitting on the top of the hill, it shouldn't be a surprise when other people see you as a bit of a target.
Unfortunately. And I think, the idea that we can stop all of that exclusively with force or military control in some shape or form. It's not a question of being for or against doing it that way. It's simply a question of what's effective, right?
It's like
And
living
when
in
you
your house. Do you
yeah,
really want to surround your house with barbed wire and machine guns? Or would you like to live in a neighborhood where the neighbors are doing pretty well too? If the neighbors are doing pretty well too, then maybe that reduces the influence they might have to want to kind of jump into your yard. Or maybe that reduces the kind of the angry scenes you might see as you drive out your driveway, or you might go where you want to go, or you want to see something interesting. Those angry, sort of difficult, desperate places of the world, that's where bad things happen and bad things get thought about, and people come and jump on us. It's a funny thing when Americans say they don't care about foreign policy, they don't care about other countries. I think, do you remember what happened on 9/11? I think we remember that. That was my second day at aid. I sort of remember it a lot. And, those are some angry people. I mean, Pearl Harbor was similar. There's a lot of times in our lives when the United States, which is a country of immigrants, ends up being forced to deal with people from other countries. And how are we going to deal with those people? Are we just going to be hostile? Are we going to be friendly? Are we going to be collaborative? I mean, there's different ways we can treat people from
yeah.
other countries.
Yeah, and maybe getting into some specifics. You touched on a lot there. Actually, we had another guest who's actually grew up in Medellin, Colombia, who spoke to this, but it was a whole different activity. It involved plantain chips and farmers who in Peru working with the Peruvian government who were willing to chop down and get rid of all their coca trees. Well, they needed another livelihood, right? And so this project created a partnership with a company that wanted a greater supply of plantains for their plantain chips, part of their snack line. You worked in Peru.
Yeah.
You might have worked on that project or a
Similar
similar
one.
one around, at some point, but other products other than that.
So I got to mention chocolate. We got to mention chocolate. And when we mention chocolate, I got to mention Mr. Beast, who is your competitor on YouTube. I'm just going to say that. And he's
Right.
done pretty well, reasonably
I think he's
well.
doing a little bit better.
Maybe better than you. Anyway, Mr. Beast launched a line of chocolate bars called Feastables, which you can find around. He wanted to disrupt the chocolate business. I was fascinated by this because I bought one. I'm a chocolate fan. I always have chocolate around. And I was fascinated to see his first launch. It was organic cacao from Peru. Now that was interesting. That's where the cacao is from. Because USAID planted 50 or 60,000 hectares of cacao in Peru. So you're welcome, Mr. Beast, if you're watching this, because that's kind of where that came from, was a USAID program. So you're welcome for the little support we gave you in launching your chocolate program. Why would we do that? Obviously, there's a cocaine problem in Peru, and people say let's give them an alternative crop. That was part of the program, and there's some politics there. But I'll just say this: is that it turns out chocolate's a better business than cocaine. I used to sit with farmers and we used to talk about it. Chocolate's bigger than cocaine. The customers are happier. They like it more. It's a funny thing. I used to ask the farmers, would you rather have your kids eating chocolate or cocaine? And none of them wanted their kids eating cocaine, even though they were growing coke. It was sort of amazing. And there was this lie that the farmers always made more money in cocaine than they made in chocolate. The reason it was a lie was that the farmers made a lot of gross income, but then they never added up how much it cost to harvest it. And at the end, they didn't have that much money, whereas our cacao and chocolate guys actually made more money. So in Peru, it was probably the biggest success story when it came to this idea of creating an alternative value chain or an alternative revenue stream for farmers to get them out of the cocaine business. Now, it didn't work everywhere. It worked in the parts where we worked, but it was sort of amazing. I got to be the person that planted 100,000 acres of cocoa for chocolate all over the jungles of certain parts of Peru. And what was cool is watching the Peruvian export market go from $30 million to over 1.2 billion last year in cocoa and chocolate products, 500 chocolate companies. It took off. We created $1 billion market there. Peru was nowhere in terms of cacao exports. Now you can say, does that matter to Americans? Well, we eat a lot of chocolate. Turns out we care. Mr. Beast cared. So he launched a line of Feastables with this chocolate, by the way, which was kind of cool. But the other thing is that meant that was a bunch of farmers that were not going to Texas. That was a bunch of farmers that were not going to Arizona or flooding the United States markets. That was a bunch of farmers that were actually not burning down the forest, which we care about, because you don't burn down a cocoa forest. It's not economic. You've got to have these reasons. And by the way, it wasn't just cacao forest. It was an agroforest system. So you'd have bananas and hardwoods and corn and beans. So you have kind of this agroforest system, which is fantastic for the cacao, also fantastic for the farmers.
It's interesting that there's plenty to unpack there and get into, but one of the things that stands out to me about that, and this is something when I was in the implementation side of the work, delivery side, we were constantly having to pay attention to, and they call it sustainability, and that word's used in different contexts now, and that's all good and well. In our context, in doing foreign assistance programs, right? That simply meant if you're going to do a project, if we're going to spend money on a project, it shouldn't be just giving something away for the sake of giving something away. For the most part, I mean, you have a crisis situation or something that's different. You're providing aid to save people's lives, right? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the kind of, slow, thoughtful investment to develop a market, for example, right? So why I'm bringing that up and why it stood out to me is we talked about going from $30 million a year to $1.2 billion a year. That was something that we left with them and they developed and grew. That's something that just has now happened organically. So
it's taken off.
The argument to be made for ROI, for return on investment from that, is a no-brainer, actually.
I was able to, as part of that, I was just saying we set up an event called the Salon of Cacao and Chocolate, and it survived COVID. 20 or 30,000 people show up every year. And I went back this last year, 15 years later. It was so much fun. And to watch 500 little chocolate companies. And I have to tell you, I'll throw a rock at the Belgians just for a minute. I brought Belgians in to show Peruvians how to make chocolate. And the Belgians turned their noses up and said, it's impossible for anyone that doesn't have years of experience to learn to make chocolate. And my comment to them was, if they can make cocaine, they can make chocolate. It's not that damn hard. All right. And it turns out the Peruvians got the idea. Oh my gosh. They've got this chef tradition. They've got this culinary tradition.
Exactly.
They've got this French tradition. They just picked it up and boom, now you've got them creating bonbons that taste like all kinds of things. And it is this whole sector that's grown up around this specialty cocoa and chocolate business. And it's environmentally sustainable. It's good for the environment. It's good for the birds. It's good for the employees. It's really good for the country. And it's sort of this impressive sort of angle on how a environmentally sustainable value chain exists and flourishes, and it's huge. And now you see, and I love it, you see Peruvian chocolate in everywhere. You go to Europe and you go to Dubai, Peruvian chocolate. None of that existed before we did that.
Yeah, which is just cool. It's cool to think about too, and it's the way I would describe that is that's a situation where everybody's won. We are, and Mr. B, you think of Mr. B as an American businessman, right? So when you talk about how we benefit from these kinds of projects, or how we have benefited from them, because we're not doing that anymore. That was something that was kind of done and done, right? That
Yeah.
you worked on, created a market. And American businessmen, business people, they now have access to more suppliers, to better suppliers. You increase global competition. But I mean, we're benefiting from that, right?
Totally. It's always the resale. One thing it was funny, USDA did a hard look. Aid invested in flowers in Colombia way back in the day. Colombia got into the flower business on an aid project. That was an aid project. And it was sort of fascinating. I was with the USDA guys that studied it 50 years later. It was that long ago. And what was interesting is that Colombia dominates the flower business in the United States. I think it's like 80% of the flowers sold in America are Colombian. And you can think, man, what did the Colombians do? They wrecked the American flower market. Well, the USDA guys were very careful to point out that even though there's, I don't know what it is, $4 or $5 million of exports of, much more than that, $1 billion of exports of flowers coming out of Colombia, the value added in the United States is like 4 times. So the florists, the deliverers, everyone who's buying flowers, there's 4 times as much value addition that comes from actually distributing and selling those flowers than the Colombians get by just exporting them to the States. There's an entire value chain there that started up with airplanes and cooled containerized systems and the whole 9 yards. And yet the Americans make huge amounts of money on this. So who makes more money on Peruvian chocolate, the Peruvians or Mr. Beast? Mr. Beast, because you always make more on the consumer value added side. So there is always this relationship where, yeah, there's a raw material coming out of there. Hopefully it's value added. Hopefully we actually make some value added product out of it. And then when you end up selling it in the United States, the biggest value is always closest to the consumer. So whoever buys it is who ends up, or ends up selling it to the consumer, ends up benefiting. So absolutely. And you think about the number of products imported in the United States, it's colossal. It's just a massive amount of products that are imported, food products and all kinds of things. And Americans like these products. And it's sort of a fascinating thing. If somebody said to me, well, anyway, I won't go into that, but I just say that we like a lot of products from a lot of places in the world, turns out.
Yeah. And even sometimes, not to get too much into this, because some of the stuff gets, when you're talking about manufacturing or something, but there's a lot that we use and that we depend on where there's parts that are manufactured somewhere else, or there's parts that raw ingredients or raw things and then they get, processed into something else. Right. And I mean, our economic engagement in the markets where these products, either the raw materials are coming from, or there's value add manufacturing production of some kind, it's kind of just the way it is. And it's interwoven in our daily lives as consumers, right?
And we're a country of immigrants. We like things from everywhere. Have you ever had Irish soda bread? Or have you ever had, what's sort of funny is, it's kind of a joke with my family sometimes, is we say, you want to have Scottish food tonight? You guys have done a good job. Scottish food with the big yellow M, because of course the McDonald's brothers were first generation Scots, of course Ray Kroc made it big, but they were Scots. So all of our food ends up, Italian food, fish food. I was trying to think of what's genuinely American. It might be barbecue. I don't know if barbecue started, but we have all these foods that come from other places, the preference that come from other places. There's so many things that come from other places. And it sort of cracks me up. I always think our language happens to come from another country, didn't it? It came from England, right? We don't speak American. We actually speak English, which came from England. So as a country of immigrants, it turns out our even language is imported. Amazingly. We're all imported, as is our language is imported. So it's sort of interesting when the United States, which is a country of immigrants who basically gets all the fantastic things from around the world, decides that it's not interested in the rest of the world. And you realize at some point that's not going to last very long, because it turns out we are connected to the rest of the world in so many ways.
Right. And I think, as an aside, I think barbecue might be the one thing. I believe it was our American version of barbecue was invented in North Carolina or in the Carolinas a long time ago, right? But that's for another time. I think just to, I don't know, reemphasize your point. I mean, I grew up eating Greek food. My dad's not even a first generation Greek immigrant, but he comes from a family of Greek immigrants, and we grew up eating Greek food. People ask me to make them Greek food all the time, because they know where I live in St. Louis, you have to come to me if you want real Greek food. Maybe a topic also for another time, but something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, something you said there, though,
I have to say, my Colombian wife, who originally came from Colombia, she says, "What's the original American food?" And I had to think for a while. It's really not hamburgers. That was, meat, potatoes. That's Scottish originally. There's all these different foods that came from other places. Barbecue was about the only thing I could come up with, which seemed genuinely sort of invented in the United States. Even donuts had kind of this London thing, and ice cream, gelato. I mean, there's a lot of foods that we sort of took and Americanized, and there's
Yeah.
good stories about that, right? We sort of Americanized cricket and called it baseball, and we invented it. But anyway, there's a lot of these other stories where we took things from other countries, which is fantastic. The fortune cookie, right, as you may know, is not from China. That was, that's an American invention. And so
Yeah.
there's all these
Just
great things
pizza
that we do
Italian. Right.
where we fuse, these
Yeah.
foods together. And that's sort of the fantastic, I don't know if it's cool anymore to talk about melting pot, but that was always sort of the amazing thing about the United States is you get all these fantastic things from other parts of the world, and you get these fusions and these mixes and all these things that were amazing, where you could have Chinese food and Irish soda bread and all these other kinds of things in the same afternoon. I mean, it's one of the things that makes America fantastic.
In the same afternoon on the same street in a lot of American cities, even in American small towns. I mean, you have that. But something related to that, something you said earlier about, you know, do you want to like protect your house with barbed wire and weapons and all this because you have dangerous neighbors or hostile neighbors, or do you want all your neighbors to kind of be doing well and have a level of kind of affluence or at least prosperity, right? So when we think about the United States and the question of do we just cut off, is it even possible to cut off all ties with the rest of the world and not only not be meaningfully engaged, but just not be engaged at all? I think about that a lot, and with the dismantling of our foreign aid system of USAID and everything that has meant, what's kind of unfolding because of that, and what may happen down the line. Maybe you could just speak to that a little bit, because you spent, I mean,
A lot of years.
you spent a lot of years, but it was primarily overseas. I mean, you were
Yeah,
living
yeah.
in Peru, Afghanistan. Where else actually were
I
you?
Pretoria, South Africa, Guatemala, Colombia. I lived prior to USA, Chile, Japan. Lived in Afghanistan, Iraq, Cairo most recently. The one thing about Americans I find interesting is this: Americans, when they go overseas, are sort of fantastic. There is this natural desire of Americans to fix things. We like to get involved. Habitat for Humanity is kind of a fun example. Americans show up and they build a house in a day, and they just love it. You know what I mean? They can't get enough of it, this kind of thing. And when we go overseas, you'll see all this, and you see Peace Corps kids, and you see other folks that are running around and saying, "Man, we could build this street, we could build this house, we could put in this telephone system, we could do X, Y, and Z." And this is bipartisan. This is left and right. And one of the things that was interesting
Yeah.
about American development, I always said, was like maybe against some other countries or versus some other countries, we always wanted to see quick results. It doesn't matter who we were. We wanted to see something come out of this. We were going to spend some money. We wanted to see results come out of this. Bootstrapping. We have kind of this idea that everybody just needs a hand in life. You know what I mean? And so all those us folks in development, we were just, let's give them a hand and see if they can step into this. Now, some people culturally stepped into things and it took off, like the Peruvian cacao and chocolate story. Some things didn't take off, like some of the things we tried to do in Afghanistan and things like that. But I think it's interesting is that the natural inclination of Americans overseas is to get involved and to fix things. If somebody made me president, and I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, Alex, just so we're clear, no, nobody's voting for me. But if they did, I would want to make it a constitutional amendment that every American needs to spend a couple of months overseas, get a passport, pick a country, and go overseas. Because I think it's very difficult to understand your own country until you compare it to other countries. It's sort of in that comparison when you learn things. You sort of think, oh, that's how they do it here. That's how we do it here. You compare the foods, you compare the governance systems, you compare how they do banking, how they say hello, all those kinds of things. I think America is, I am a believer in American exceptionalism. I think America is one of the greatest countries in the history of the world. But I don't often think that Americans know why it's so great.
Yeah, I agree.
And they don't understand what makes it great. And one of the ways you know how something is great is when you compare it to other things, and you can compare it kind of generally superficially, but you can also compare it in a very detailed way. And one of the things that makes America great is we like fixing things. We like working hard. And I've often felt like when Americans don't go overseas, we sort of like get ingrown and we start fighting with each other and we sort of climb all over each other and we kind of create these partisan fights and all the kind of things. Whereas if we just go overseas and throw a hand out and help folks here and there, it'd make us better. It'd make us better Americans.
That was my experience too. Why would we not want to have these business relationships, these governmental political relationships? It's the notion that why would you not want everyone to win? Right?
Absolutely.
It's not, I mean, most things aren't really like kind of zero sum game. I don't really think that's how relations between nations, relations between people, that doesn't really work.
Well, Econ
So I
101,
think that's
trade
part
makes
of the,
everybody richer. Sorry.
say
Exactly.
that
Econ
again.
101, trade makes everybody richer for everyone who ever took an econ class. That there, it's funny. Politicians around the world love this idea of self-sufficiency. We're just going to own our own stuff. We're going to grow our own stuff, make our own stuff, dig our own stuff, and live off our own stuff. And ironically, that makes everyone poorer. It always makes the country poor. It makes the neighbors poor. It makes everybody poor. And I wish everyone had to take Econ 101 so they could actually learn why living on your own things actually makes you poor. It doesn't make you wealthier. And there's not a zero-sum game. It turns out when you trade with your neighbor, and we all remember the coconut and palm leaf examples from, I don't know, Daniel Ricardo or your Econ 101 class, is how this works. And the math is there, but it turns out trade is good for us. And it turns out the more we trade, the wealthier everybody gets. And it turns out to be one of the great wealth creators in the history of the world is trade. And what I love about trade is it always happens. The Romans traded, the Chinese traded, the Russians traded. It's not like people have to figure this out, really. I mean, it's happened for centuries.
Yeah,
Sometimes
exactly.
trade is up a little more, down a little more, but it always happens. I heard an economist say a while ago that the greatest moment in free trade was in the 1890s when the British Empire was sort of promoting free trade around the world within their empire. They obviously had some other issues, but at least from a trade point of view, it was a wide open world 100 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about food earlier. I love to cook and I love to eat more than anything. Potatoes are indigenous to Peru. So are eggplant. So is eggplant. Tomatoes, right? I mean, they're not even indigenous to North America. They're indigenous to Peru, I think it is, right? And then I love this one that apples are from Central Asia. Isn't that right?
Right.
Almost positive apples come from Central Asia. It's
You know,
almost like
peaches
people
were called.
think of it as like the all American fruit, but it's like, oh, it's not actually American.
What were peaches called before they were called peaches? Arab apples. Here's a funny story. It just kind of goes back to grapes. So one of my favorite crops to work on in Afghanistan were grapes, seedless grapes. Turns out seedless grapes were probably invented in Afghanistan by accident. I don't know, 500 BC. When Alexander the Great went through there, his guys were already talking about seedless grapes. Afghans have many different kinds of grapes. They've been growing grapes for thousands of years. If you talk to an Afghan, they can tell you where in the country the grape comes from. The Turks got their grapes from the Afghans. Thompson got his grapes from the Turks. So just remember that Thompson seedless grapes are probably Afghan. And that's interesting to me. My grandparents grew up in Gridley, California. And it's funny, the whole fruit and nut culture, which came out of Afghanistan, it was fascinating. My grandmother used to say, we were always afraid of some of those farmers. I said, why was that? She said, well, they had turbans. And it turns out a lot of the grape and nut guys in Northern California were from Pakistan. They were from Iran because that's where the crops were from. And so the entire California fruit and nut industry came from, in many cases, Middle Easterners that realized the weather was similar and they came across and planted the same grapes, the same nuts. And thanks, now we have this fantastic California fruit and nut business. So it's sort of fascinating to realize that all of these big things we have in America tended to be imported from somebody. Haas avocados didn't start in the States. The Guatemalans, I tell you, they came from Guatemala originally. USDA went out and collected sand cuttings from around the world 100 years ago and brought them all to the States. And the various products that are like that. Guess where chocolate's from? Probably, the Spanish got it from Mexico, but the Mexicans got it from the Guatemalans before the Guatemala. And the Mayans probably got it from the Andeans, probably Peru.
Right.
So,
right.
This is all these crops. Where do they come from? And of course, coffee comes from Africa. So, we live in an interconnected world. It's not a bad thing. It's a fantastic thing. And as we develop these products together, we can grow together in prosperity. I mean, that's really the joint prosperity, I think, should be kind of where we're headed towards, in terms of overall long-term foreign policy. When you don't move towards joint prosperity, you move towards desperation, and desperation leads to violence, and then violence leads to, all the terrible things we've been dealing with.
Yeah, I think that actually, I think that's extremely well put. Actually, I don't, let me ask you about something, because I know you worked on some big deals with the private sector while you were at USAID,
Sure.
because there was a whole shop there called, for a long time, it was called the Global Development Alliance.
Can I tell a Colin Powell story? Can I tell you a Colin Powell story?
Yeah, please do. Because I was about to do my shout out to my dad, because when he was running USAID, that's when the Global Development Alliance launched. But anyway, you worked on some big deals there. So tell us about Colin Powell, and then I want to talk about that too.
Well, I got so funny story. I started in 2001, right? Prior to that, I had been at a company where they had a big company event, and Colin Powell came hawking his NGO. I called America's Promise. And he was trying to get us as company employees to make donations to his NGO before he was Secretary of State.
I didn't know.
It's absolutely America's Promise. He was the executive director of this, and he was running around looking for contributions. So when 2000, he gets assigned to be, asked to be Secretary of State, it was Holly Weiss and your dad, I think, that went and said to Colin Powell, we ought to do these public-private partnerships where the private sector invests in development programs together. Colin Powell had just come from raising money at an NGO. This is sort of obvious. It was like, of course. Didn't we always do this? I mean, I think for Colin Powell, this is the easiest thing that you can imagine. So I would come out of the private sector, and I'd been a food broker and dealt with all these contributions. The private sector is less cynical than we think sometimes. There's a lot of corporate donations. I don't know, 30, 40 billion a year is donated by companies to do kinds of things, whether it's individuals or companies. Anyway, and so I met Holly early on, and I come out of the food business, and so I started doing GDAs. I don't know if your dad realized this, but there was something called the GDA Secretariat at the time, and there was about $30-40 million attached to it. I end up using a third to half of that. I did a bunch of GDAs, a bunch of alliances in Central America. We helped give Rainforest Alliance its kickstart. We gave it its first money. Now it's a big beast. That was kind of what we started with. Rainforest Alliances included Chiquita Banana and Kroger and Procter & Gamble and all the coffee products, IKEA and Gibson Guitar. We worked on trees and forests and things like that. Then we started doing, so I've been doing GDAs. I did 30 GDAs when I was in Central America. And then when I finally, we did a couple in Afghanistan, believe it or not, back in the day, Mercy Corps and CRS. Then we went to Peru, and the big Peru Alliance was a GDA, which meant aid put in some money and the private sector put in 3 times the money. So it was 1 to 3, and it was a donation. That was kind of the idea in my day, is we didn't want to just count their co-investment. We wanted them to make a donation. And that was how it started. That's how we planted all the cacao. So again, if I'd been made boss, I thought, why don't we make sure that every dollar that U.S. government spends is matched 2 to 3 times by the private sector? There's even an interesting tax implication there, because if a company can make a tax deductible donation that then doesn't get taxed, come back to AID money is tax money at the end of the day, there's a certain logic there to kind of say, well, if the company's going to be doing this kind of good work overseas anyway, why don't we let them spend some of their money and then we'll match it? Now, there is an important side. The U.S. government needs to be there, because when the U.S. government's there, and frankly, the Peruvian government and the other governments pay attention. And that's the other piece of this. You have to have a little skin in the game, both sides. And those are the best programs I worked on. So I worked on the biggest GDAs in aid history. I worked on the 2 biggest ones, which was the Cacao Alliance, which was, I think, a couple $100 million by the time we were done with it, now generating $1.5 billion in cacao. And it also did some coffee and some other things. And then we did another big alliance during COVID with healthcare. And this was the other big alliance we did was called HEDA, Health, Electrification, and Telecommunications Alliance. And the reason we did that one was we realized this actually started over, I don't want to be political, right? We don't want to be political, but I'll just say a certain leader was distributing ventilators around Africa during COVID. And the problem, I was at Power Africa at the time, and there was no place to plug them in. Realized, oh no. What's going to happen with all these ventilators that never get plugged in? And then we got into this issue of the fact that, Turns out healthcare needs electricity to keep vaccines cold, to keep the lights on at the clinics, to keep telecoms connected, all these kinds of things. And it turned out our health programs were spending more on diesel than they were on vaccines. In some ways, the diesel costs were costing them, more money than anything else cost them. And so it was this crying shame. And what's interesting when you go to rural Africa is the argument against solar power is not a carbon argument. It's an argument of you don't have any other power. That's all you've got. And I saw this in Afghanistan. There was, I sort of joke anyway. There's a lot of solar power there. Solar power works in rural areas. I mean, it's just fundamental. It's what you have available. The sun's shining, and even though it doesn't shine all the time, it shines a lot more than it doesn't. And there's a plenty of time to use that. And so I think charging up cell phones, keeping the lights on, keeping vaccines cold, and yeah, you always match it up with a little generator, some sort of hybrid system. But that was our last alliance, which was 50 million from aid and 150 million from the private sector. It was a $200 million alliance, and the intention was to electrify 10,000 clinics. People love this. This was Bill Gates, Gates Foundation was involved, and Global Fund and lots of others. That was the biggest alliance in aid history. But I just mentioned that because that's a good example of, you have an objective, which is to keep people healthy, keep them from getting sick, help them get the vaccine or whatever they need. But they need something. They need electricity. They need something like this. So we got to bring folks together. So one of our best partners in that turned out to be telecoms. Because the telecoms companies, in fact, our early partners were Voda and Orange, because to keep the cell phone towers on, you have a similar problem. They need power. Yeah. So a lot of the cell phone towers were actually adding solar. And so in some cases, the power for the cell phone tower was also running the power for the clinic. And there's a little bit of a quid pro quo there potentially, because cell phone towers have a theft problem, right? They're trying to keep their towers intact. And communities realize that if they left the tower alone, the clinic stayed powered. And they need that clinic. And so you end up with this issue. It was a sort of horrifying thing to realize that how many women in Africa give birth in the dark. Candles and cell phone lights and the doctors. It's just, baby wants to be born at 2 a.m. and everything's dark and all the health indicators are bad. It's sort of one of the most awful things I can think of is, you take your loved one to the clinic to give birth and the lights are off. And it's just one of those things that nobody wants that.
No. And then back to your point about Americans and traveling and trying to be some people wanting to be disconnected. You just think about something like that. Why would you want anyone in that position anywhere?
Horrible. I mean, yeah. Anyways, that's one of the things we're saying. Yeah.
But
I think so. The thing is that these big public-private partnerships, it was one of my pet peeves, is that sometimes we would write big contracts. You worked under some of those and others. Yeah, sure. But my thought was always, the private sector's out there. One of the things about Americans too is that we end up, and I think this is sort of culturally ironic, Americans give more money to charities than anybody on the planet, religious charities. The same Americans that say they don't care about anybody will write big checks to their churches, who then spend the money overseas. So it's sort of a funny thing. And so it's, apparently we care in different ways. We care to do different things. So my best partners when we were working overseas were often the religious charities. It was CRS or the Lutherans or whoever it was, Mercy Corps, or, World Vision, others. And so it's sort of interesting to think that somehow Americans don't care about people overseas when they write enormous amounts of checks to these folks overseas. And again, having U.S. government no longer be in that business is a bit of a vacuum, because now when you need to move a shipment of vaccines that's been funded by the private sector and you need to get the local minister to okay that, well, is the embassy going to get involved? I don't know. Do they have any skin in the game? I don't know. And so this is kind of a question where is the United States really stepping out of that game where we don't care about the vaccines or we don't care about the health, or we don't care about those kinds of things. I think at the end of the day, there's going to be people in every embassy that end up caring because it does matter and they're going to do their best. It's just we may end up doing it in kind of a disorganized way or an ad hoc way, or the poll and econ officers will get pulled in different directions and we'll end up doing some of it somehow because Americans like to help people. We just do.
Yeah. I mean, and when you think about what does it mean to be American, the American character, what are our values? I think that's a significant, almost fundamental part of it.
We're extraordinarily charitable. I say, when we used to have fights over official development assistance numbers with the Europeans, your dad used to bring this up, and I loved it. It was the fact that, yes, our official development assistance numbers were always lower than the Europeans were as a percent of their GDP. but our private contributions eclipsed them, multiple times. And so it's one of those things that no, Americans are actually rather generous. We help people around the world. We're going to continue to help people around the world. That's not going away. And I'll say this too, from a presidential point of view, there's never been a president in history, maybe, I don't know, some exception, but none that I know of, that didn't want to make gifts here and there. Every president wants to go abroad and make a gift. I mean, PEPFAR was President Bush's program, Compassionate Conservative. I thought it was fantastic. This is an amazing way to say, you know what, here's a health issue, but we care, right? You can be a conservative and care. Being a conservative doesn't mean you don't care, right? I think that's kind of, there's a lot of folks that are Christians. Christian means you care. That's part of the idea. So as a Christian conservative, you got to care, which is where conservative, I think, Compassionate Conservative came from, is where PEPFAR came from, the big program, to support people who are suffering from AIDS around the world. But I think there's a lot of those kinds of programs around the world where people do care. I don't think there's any sense in the world that somehow conservatives shouldn't care or don't care. That's a wrong-headed notion.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, obviously I grew up around that. So, PEPFAR was launched when my dad was at USAID and when you were there. And, anyhow,
I just got to have to throw a word to those folks, and we know who those are, to our true libertarian friends, all of you libertarians out there. If you really want to live in a world with no government, where it doesn't matter, where it's you and your guns and you survive the any way you can, I suggest you go to parts of Sudan right now, parts of Afghanistan. That's about as libertarian as you get, because everybody's got a gun and you survive the best you can. And it is not a happy place. I can tell you, I just worked on that. We planted enough sorghum for about 5 million people running for their lives. It's a horrible way to live. So that chaos that comes from a truly lawless system is not a happy place to be. Nobody wants that. And when those places fall apart, it's funny. I have to mention this, is that the reason that the UN and the World Bank and the IMF, all these things were created, is people were horrified by World War II. I think one of the reasons that we're okay getting rid of it all is that World War II was a long time ago. That's 1940s. We're 2020. Kind of forget about that. My father was a POW. Grandfather was a POW. World War II. He was shot down over Japan and spent 18 months as a guest of Tojo. And so I feel that a little bit. And he was a war hero and things like that. So I remember World War II. It kind of built in my family. His name was Loren Stoddard too. So when you Google Loren Stoddard, his pictures come up more than mine, which is a good thing. I think it's fantastic. He's a war hero. And I'm proud of him for that. But when people forget about the horror of World War II, is when they think, well, why do we need all these systems? Why do we have all these programs? Why do we care what anyone else thinks? Well, when things go bad, they go bad. They go really bad. And I think when people stop worrying about how bad they can get and think, what's the worst that can happen? Pearl Harbor, World War II, 9/11. A lot of bad things can happen if you don't care about the neighbors. Terrible thing.
No, and it's kind of like, what's the worst thing that could happen? It's something a lot worse than you could even concoct in imagining it,
A simple thing. One of the big health programs we have in Africa is detecting new diseases. By the way, does that matter? I don't know. Anybody had chikungunya or Zika, or hope you didn't have Mpox or any of these other kinds of diseases? Ebola, all these kinds of things. I mean, who knows where coronavirus came from exactly? It seems to come from the other side, but our ability to detect diseases around the world, that seems to be kind of a big deal. I'll tell you one thing, you can put up all the border walls you want and customs can do whatever they want. They're not going to stop those diseases from coming in. That's going to happen.
No, they don't recognize borders and walls, as my dad would say. Nope. Well, look, we covered a lot. I love your stories. Might even do another episode because I think you have I know you have a lot more, but once I start competing with Mr. Beast, we can come back around for like episode 50 or something on YouTube.
Absolutely.
But is there anything else you wanted to share, add before we sign out?
I'll give you a little gratitude. I'm so grateful for the years I got to work with USAID. I don't regret anything. It was fantastic. It was great to work with Americans that wanted to do good things for other folks. I love that. When I was a little kid, my whole objective in life was to figure out how to help people and make a buck and figure out how to do both those things. And I didn't get rich over it, but I certainly, we paid bills, we had to do what we had to do. Now we're retired, but we got to help a lot of people. And I think about those people, and that made my life so much richer. And when people look at politics and things like that, we have relationships. I'm right now starting a company. It's called Verticor. We're doing consulting on the issues of stakeholders. And I'll just mention this. What's a stakeholder? A stakeholder are like your in-laws. And I think this is a fascinating thing. You might not have fallen in love with your in-laws. You have fell in love with your better half probably, but the in-laws are hanging around. Those in-laws are sort of like the global neighbors. You know what I mean? They're around. And maybe you're interested in a graphite mine in Mozambique, but the farmers are kind of upset. Or you're interested in, I don't know, gold in Peru, but the little gold miners are upset. So there's always these people pesky hanging around these investments, these pesky people. And I think it's interesting to think, if you don't take care of them, you know what happens? The trucks don't move. They just stop moving. Sometimes the warehouses get burned down. Sometimes bad things happen. And it's one of those things that if you don't learn how to make good friends with your neighbors, even as an investor, then bad things are going to happen to your investment. So there's this false dichotomy. This goes back to Milton Friedman. There are no stakeholders. It's a made up term, I think he said, or something like that. And all I got to say is, when the stakeholders interrupt your value chain, then the stockholders don't get paid.
And then you see that they're actually a thing. It's not.
Turns out they matter. Turns out they really matter. And good managers know how to take care of the in-laws. I can say that my mother-in-law right now loves me. I'm in in-law nirvana. So that's good. I hope all of you get there. We all ought to get to in-law nirvana. So my mother-in-law likes me and she makes me food and things like that. But hope everyone gets to that level. But at the end of the day, we're about peace, love, and charity, and trying to take care of our neighbors and take care of each other and ourselves. And inclusive prosperity is a real thing. And I don't think there's anything that anyone who really understands economics can really throw a rock at that. And people misunderstand it. I'd have to say it's sort of funny to me that the anti-globalizers switched parties. Strange. There was one party that was pushing anti-global, then it switched to the other party. Strange. I don't know why that happens exactly. Regardless of which party it is, you're both wrong.
I completely agree with you. Loren, thanks a lot for sharing all these stories and insight. Sure. Loved having you. Appreciate all the work you did at USAID through your career. I should say that too, including when we were working on the same thing and maybe you didn't even realize it. Yeah, that does it for today. Thanks a lot, folks, for listening all the way through here to these cool stories. Once again, like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.